Happy Independence Day everyone, and welcome back to the garage. We're going to continue on our disassembling phase of the project in week 2, and this weekend we're taking out the L28 engine and the 5-speed manual transmission out of the 280Z for the first time. But first, since I sold my last engine hoist before moving down here to Raleigh, I had to go get another one, so I'm assembling it now. It's the DIY Mechanic Special, the Harbor Freight's Pittsburgh 2-ton hoist. I also got their weight leveler just in case, but I have a feeling I won't need it. We got the engine all ready to be pulled out last weekend, so theoretically it should be quick and easy to strap it up and pull it right out. So let's get started. Before pulling out the engine, I decided to drain the engine oil, and I'm not entirely sure why because I really didn't have to. The engine oil, as always, looked pretty good, no signs of water, and it looked pretty darn clear. I mean, I keep changing the oil after less than 1,000 miles of driving since I just constantly tinker with the engine, so I guess that's not a surprise. As I was moving the drain pan away from the car, a bug crawled into my ear and I panicked and tipped the pan over. I'm just doing a great job of destroying my garage floor so far. After lowering the car back down and moving it backwards so that the hoist has enough room in the front, I realized that the hoist legs were too high off the ground to go under the lower control arms of the Datsun. So I had to re-raise the front end back up by a couple of 2x4s, and since the front end was raised, I needed to put the hoist arm to be at half ton so that I could get the engine up high enough to clear up out of the bay. And since I'm not pulling out the transmission with the engine, this should be perfectly fine. I personally like using ratchet straps instead of chains to pull engines out because I can adjust a ratchet to level out the weight and I don't have to buy a leveler, although I did buy one just in case. Also, the ratchet straps are much easier to maneuver around the crevices of the engine to secure it, but I was careful not to put any pressure on any fragile components, especially the fuel rail, which would be really easy to bend if I wasn't careful. I forgot to film it, but I did remove the 4 bolts from the engine mount, which was the last step before lifting the engine out of the bay. It was really pretty easy. The only challenging part was disconnecting the engine from the transmission because it didn't happen that easily. I first thought I missed a bell housing bolt or two, but after some work with a crowbar, the input shaft of the transmission did pull out of the back of the engine and I was clear to lift the engine out. I honestly don't know if it would have been easier to pull out the transmission with the engine. I assume that would have been tricky as well, just in a different way. Although, as you can see, you can do it by yourself, this whole thing would have been much more straightforward with 2 people and 2 sets of eyes. Alright, so the engine is out of the car and I'm taking a moment to celebrate. I know I don't look that happy, but I am. It's not my first time to pull an engine out of a car, but it happens rarely enough that I'm always amused by it. We won't be doing much with the engine, so we'll be probably putting it aside for a while. It might actually go in storage until we're ready to work on it. Now we have to get the transmission out of the car, but there's several things we have to do first, beginning with lifting the car back up. I want it really high up so I can easily pull out the transmission from beneath the car, but I have a few problems. First, I sold my quick jacks to a buddy of mine so I could get some money back for my restoration budget. And the quick jacks aren't really that great for doing a frame-up restoration anyway, since they take up so much space and don't allow easy access to all the components underneath the car. Second, the frame rail underneath the floor pan on the passenger side, which I will show you guys later, it's so rusted that it's just not a great structural point to put jack stands under. And I need to have that frame rail replaced, which means I need to find another way to lift the car up. What I really need here is a 4-post lift, but obviously I don't have the budget for that. So what's my solution? A homemade set of vehicle dollies. Now, this isn't as sketchy as it looks. I built these out of spare 2x4s that I had left over from building the shelves, and I used 20 casters, each rated at 300 pounds, which in total should easily double the weight of the car, probably well over triple by the time we're done with the disassembly. So each platform has five swiveling casters with rakes so that I can push the car in any direction, and also I can lock them in place so that the car doesn't roll away. I am embarrassed to admit that I spent like $200 making these, but at least this means that I don't have to spend money on the lift. It's probably more cost and space efficient to build these out of metal, but honestly, I trust the strength of these 2x4s more than I trust the strength of my welds. I'll show you guys how I made them if you guys are interested, but they're pretty simple to make. Somebody should start making these out of metal and selling them because they're pretty awesome. These are the next best thing to a 4-post lift. I have so much room for activities, including easily dragging out the transmission from beneath the car. Speaking of which, we'll tackle that first thing tomorrow morning because it's getting pretty late. Pulling out the transmission should also be pretty straightforward at this point. We just need to remove a couple of sensors, the clutch slave cylinder, mount it up to the transmission jack, unbolt the crossmember support, and it should pop right out, at least in theory. I started by removing the middle section of the exhaust because it was hanging on the transmission. You should also remove the heat shield since the drive shaft, which sits above it, will hit the heat shield when the transmission gets lowered. Also, I drained the transmission fluid so I don't make a mess when I disconnect all the sensors and pull the transmission from the drive shaft. I know I'm not supposed to pull the drain plug without checking that I can remove the top fill plug, but this is coming out anyway, so I guess it doesn't matter. We also need to remove a couple of sensors. I actually don't know what these sensors do, but I'm gonna go ahead and guess that one of them is a sensor for the speedometer and the other one feeds the reverse light. A 2-minute forum search will probably confirm or deny that though. And for better or worse, there was enough accumulated grease down here to keep all the threads from rusting up, so they were actually pretty easy to remove. Next up is the clutch slave cylinder, which is held on by 2 small bolts. You don't have to drain the clutch cylinder fluid or anything, just remove the 2 bolts and you're all set. Now we can position the transmission jack and strap it to the transmission. I had to use a few 2x4 blocks because I raised the car up so high that the jack couldn't reach the transmission. I bought this jack from Harbor Freight a while back to get the transmission out of the 3000 GT, and I guess it's coming in handy again. I've seen guys basically reverse bench press the transmission out of the car, but that seems like a genuinely stupid idea. At least use a floor jack or just go buy one. It makes this so much easier than trying to do it without one. I apologize for the bad angle, but what I'm doing right now is loosening up the transmission crossmember now that the transmission jack is supporting the weight. It's just 2 sets of bolts and nuts. It really couldn't be more straightforward, especially if you have an impact wrench. Alright, the last step before dropping out the transmission is to make sure that the shifter is going to drop down without catching anything. I didn't really know what to do here, so my first instinct was to remove the vinyl boot. I first tried to save it by removing the whole center console, but I couldn't figure out how to do that either, and the boot was so old and riddled with holes anyway that I just ended up taking a knife to it. The funny thing is though, I actually didn't even have to do that. All you have to do is twist off the knob and just center the shifter by putting it in neutral. At that point, it'll just drop out. It would have been good to have some watch the shifter while I lower the transmission to make sure that it's dropping out smoothly, but lowering it slowly and checking intermittently, it will probably be fine. As soon as you see the shifter fall out of its hole, jiggle the whole transmission forward to separate it from the drive shaft input. You don't need tools for this, it should separate really smoothly, but if it doesn't, just use a crowbar. I put a jack to hold up the drive shaft until I'm ready to remove it. Now that the transmission and the engine are both removed, let me give you guys more of an in-depth look at what we're dealing with in terms of body panels and the frame. I think I would give this whole thing a solid B-. Just like all unrestored Datsuns, this thing does have its fair share of rust issues, but they're far from making this car unworthy of a restoration. The front quarter of the car, for instance, is in amazing shape aside from all the dirt and grime. And to be fair, I haven't taken off the fenders and the headlight housing yet, but as far as I can tell so far, there's really no bad rust issues up here. It's just mostly surface rust. Moving towards the firewall, it does get a little bit worse. Although the frame rails are in pretty much perfect condition up until the engine mounts, the rust becomes more of an issue towards the firewall due to the battery acid and the leaking brake fluid over the years. The paint is almost all gone, and although the rails seem structurally solid, there is a fair bit of grinding and potentially reinforcing that needs to be done. The rust is the worst, predictably right below the battery tray, where the acid has eaten a large hole in the back of the wheel well. You'll see this much better once we go beneath the car. Although the firewall is still intact, I'm assuming once we get to grinding the metal, it'll be so thin that we may have to cut out a piece and weld back in a fresh panel section. I can't really tell how bad the sheet metal is behind the brake booster, but this side in general does seem to have fared much better than the battery side. I don't think there's anything to be too concerned about over here. Notice that the original rubber bushings of the car are pretty much all disintegrating into dust. Sliding underneath the car, we can start to check in on the worst section, the middle of the car on the passenger side. First, I think someone tried to jack up the car on the pinch weld of the side skirt, which damaged the sheet metal. Also, there are signs of rust and very poorly done body repair and a paint job on the bottom of the fender, which makes me think that once I get to grinding down the fender to the bare metal, I am not going to be pleasantly surprised. What you're looking at now is the worst of the rust issues on this car, which is the frame rail underneath the floor pan on the passenger side. This is just beyond recovery. Not that this is a surprise, I knew all of these issues before buying the car, and this is probably the most common issues with these cars, but it's still a headache. I've done some research about how to handle this, and it sounds like the best way is to drill out the pinch welds that hold this frame rail to the floor pan and install a new one instead of trying to recover this old one. I certainly don't want to weld a new frame rail over this garbage, since that'll just make this whole problem worse. It feels unlucky that this is the side that has this issue. In fact, the other frame rail is in much better shape. Since the fuel and brake hard lines are attached to the frame rail on this side, so to tackle all of this, all of those hard lines that run from the front to the back of the car will have to be disconnected and removed, which is why I haven't tackled this yet. This problem is also one of the main reasons I wanted to do a frame-up restoration, so that I can not only fix it, but to make it better and more rigid than when it was new. And you can see the hole underneath the battery tray much better from beneath the car. And like I said, the firewall doesn't have a rust hole, but I'm assuming it's not in great shape. The floor pan has one or two holes, but generally okay as far as I can tell from beneath the car. But we'll get a better look at it once we get the seats and the carpets out of the car. And that does it for this week. Progress is a bit slow, but I am gaining confidence. I haven't encountered anything so far that fazed me, although I'm assuming that will change once I start pulling out the dashboard out of the car and start looking at a spiderweb of wires. I'm very afraid of electricals. But as far as mechanicals go, I am constantly reminded as to why I chose to work on this car rather than a more modern car. Everything really is so simple and easy to understand. I really am feeling much better about my ability to actually take this to the finish line. You know, although I am realizing that I may need to get some help from a professional frame and body restoration shop to do this thing right once I'm done stripping down the car. And while that's being done, I'll have some time to work on the engine and the transmission, so it may work out pretty well. I guess it just depends on the price quote. So again, that's it for this week. Next week we'll start tearing out the interior of the 280Z, so stay tuned for that. See you guys later.